Welcome to a short recorded lecture on the presidential term of Woodrow Wilson, focusing on domestic and foreign policy. I've provided a note sheet that you can follow along with. The link is in the notes at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to take a look at it. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is something I haven't touched on with any American president yet, and that is that American presidents are always ranked, and this has become, I guess, more of a sort of vogue thing to do in the last 10 to 15 years, especially the last, 5 to 6 years, as politics has grown sort of increasingly aggressive on both sides. So ranking presidents becomes important. But I think it's interesting to note that while the facts of history maybe don't change, our perspectives on it do change. So history is always changing. Woodrow Wilson is a great example of this. If you go back to the year 2000, he was slotted in a number 6 spot, so just out of the top 5 presidents. By the way, Abraham Lincoln is sort of consistently ranked as number 1, and that hasn't changed. But what you see between 2000 and 2021 is Woodrow Wilson falls down 7 spots, even though between that time frame, there's only 3 additional presidents. So even if Barack Obama, um, George W. Bush, and Donald J. Trump are slotted ahead of him because this would have been before Biden took office in 2021. He could have not gone any further down than 9, even if all 3 of those presidents were above him. So what changed? Well, the reality is our attitudes changed. Specifically, some of the things that we place emphasis on as a culture, our values started to shift a little bit. And the big thing that happens between 2000 and 2021 is there's more of an emphasis on race and ethnicity and race relations. And that's a category, as we're going to see, that Woodrow Wilson does very, very poorly on as a president, while he does very, very well in a lot of other things. This isn't something that you'd ever be tested on, but I think it's interesting to note how our opinions of history change over time. So Woodrow Wilson, it is important to know a little bit about his upbringing. He was born on December 28th, 1856 in Virginia. Sometimes, by the way, his date of birth is listed as December 29th. It's because he was born right around midnight, so sometimes it gets kicked around. All right. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and his mother was a minister's daughter. So he grew up with a very firm religious upbringing, and also an upbringing that put a huge amount of emphasis on education. The other thing that's really important to note about his family life is that Wilson himself would spend his teen years in Augusta, Georgia, and then in Columbia, South Carolina. So he grew up in the South. During the American Civil War, Wilson's father served as a chaplain, so minister, in the Confederate Army, and he used his church as a hospital for injured Confederate troops. As a result of all of this, Wilson is going to inherit some of the myth of the lost cause that I've talked about in other lectures and that we've learned about in other readings. He's going to inherit this idea of sort of these white supremacist concepts are going to filter down to him through his parents, and that's something that will impact his policies later on, as we'll see. Wilson graduated from Princeton University, back then it was actually called the College of New Jersey, in 1897, and then studied law at the University of Virginia. He was briefly a lawyer before receiving a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University. And actually, Wilson today remains the only US president to earn a doctorate degree. He taught at a couple of colleges before being hired by his alma mater, Princeton, in 1890. There he was a professor of law, actually, and politics. But from 1902 to 1910, Wilson was the president of Princeton, where he developed a national reputation for his educational reform policies. However, and you're going to notice I say however a bunch of times in this, during his tenure in Princeton, he also prevented the enrollment of Black students at the university. And in 1902, Wilson published a 5-volume textbook, The History of the American People, which presented an overly romanticized view of the Confederacy and described the Ku Klux Klan, a violent terrorist organization, as a, quote, roving band of knights errant, an invisible empire of the South, end quote. These are again issues why we see Wilson's stock go down over the last 20 years. In terms of personal life, Wilson's personal life is actually very tragic. I won't go too much into it right now, but in 1885, he married for the first time, but his wife is going to die 2 years into his presidency in 1914. And the personal tragedy of that and how the press wants to treat that is something that's going to both haunt him for years and also give him a very negative attitude towards the American press and newspaper organizations. So in 1910, Woodrow Wilson was elected governor of New Jersey. He actually fought machine politics and garnered national attention as a progressive reformer. And so, as a result, in 1912, the Democrats, who haven't won the presidency in a long time, nominated Wilson for president. On the other hand, the Republican Party was split over its choice of presidential candidate. Conservatives nominated the current president, William Taft, but the progressive wing of the Republican Party broke off and formed the Bull Moose Party. I talked about this in the lecture that I gave about Teddy Roosevelt. The Bull Moose Party nominates Theodore Roosevelt, who had been president from 1901 to 1909. With the Republicans divided, Wilson, who campaigned on a platform of just generally liberal reform, won 435 electoral votes compared to only 88 to Roosevelt and measly eight, for Taft. He garnered, however, only 42% of the popular vote. So this is one of those situations where we see a split ticket resulting in a candidate winning way more electoral votes than their popular vote would seem to justify. We saw the exact same thing in the election of 1824. That was the one that pitted Andrew Jackson against John Quincy Adams. And we saw it again in 1860, where Abraham Lincoln won the presidency despite winning a minority of the popular vote. In this instance, Roosevelt actually came in second place with more than 27% of the popular vote, even though his electoral count doesn't match that at all. Let's talk about his first term. At the age of 56, Woodrow Wilson was sworn into office in March 1913. He was actually the last American president to travel to his inauguration in a horse-drawn carriage, if you must know. Once in the White House, Wilson achieved significant progressive reforms. Congress first passed the Underwood-Simmons Act. The Underwood-Simmons Act reduced a tariff on imports and replaced the income with a new federal income tax. The federal income tax had been tried initially during the Civil War, then it went away for a long time, but now under Woodrow Wilson, it comes back for good. It also passed legislation establishing a couple of things. First, it establishes the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve provides a system for regulating our nation's banks, credit, and money supply today. You might recognize it as being in the news. I'm recording this in 2023 in the spring right now, and you may recognize it as that group that everybody's always wondering if they're going to raise interest rates. That's what the Federal Reserve does. It also established the Federal Trade Commission. Their job was to investigate and prohibit unfair business practices. Today, we know them and the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, as responsible for making sure that insider trading and other sort of nefarious stock things don't go on. Other accomplishments included child labor laws, an 8-hour day for work for railroad workers, and government loans to farmers. Additionally, Woodrow Wilson nominated the first ever Jewish person to the United States Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, who was confirmed by the Senate in 1916. Wilson's progressive agenda, though, did not apply to all Americans. During his first term, he oversaw the resegregation of many branches of the federal workforce, including the Treasury, the Post Office, the Bureau of Engraving, that was in charge of money, by the way, and printing, the Navy, the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, and even the Government Printing Office. This policy reversed years of progress made in integrating the federal government under different presidents and reversed hard-fought economic progress made by Black Americans since Reconstruction. But the big issue facing Woodrow Wilson was not domestic. In 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. We don't talk very much about World War I in the United States because the Americans were in it for such a short period of time. But the impacts on Europe were absolutely catastrophic. World War I pitted France, Britain, and Russia initially versus Germany and Austria Hungary initially. Italy, the Ottoman Empire are going to join at different times. Japan sort of nominally gets in there. And then Russia's going to bow out in 1917 after it goes through a revolution. But you don't really need to know that. The war lasts from 1914 to 1918. And the toll for this war, the sort of bill, is unbelievable. 9 million men are killed, 21 million soldiers are wounded, 10 million civilian casualties. Germany and France sent about 80% of their male population between 15 and 49 to war, and a huge percentage of those did not come back, earning them the nickname the Lost Generation. Initially, Wilson was determined to keep the United States out of the conflict, but he found this increasingly difficult as the years went on. On May the 7th, 1915, a German submarine torpedoed and sank the British ocean liner, the Lusitania. It killed more than 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. Wilson continued to maintain U.S. neutrality, but warned Germany that any future sinkings would be viewed by America as, quote, deliberately unfriendly, end quote. Wilson had this way, by the way, of sort of speaking like a college professor lectures. In 1916, Wilson and Vice President Marshall were renominated by the Democrats. The Republicans chose Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes as their presidential candidate. Wilson campaigned on the slogan, quote, he kept us out of war, end quote. But this time, he narrowly won victory, with an electoral margin of only 277 to 254, and with a tiny little bit more than 49% of the popular vote. Woodrow Wilson's second term in office was dominated by World War I. Although the president had advocated for peace during the initial years of the war, in early 1917, German submarines began what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant that submarines, and this is the first war that submarines were used, by the way, would begin indiscriminately sinking shipping to and from Allied nations, mostly Great Britain, but some headed to France. This was in direct contravention to what Wilson had warned Germany against doing previously. Around the same time, the United States learned about what was called the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram is a message in which Germany tried to persuade Mexico into an alliance against America, fearing that if America entered the war and could focus its full attentions on Germany, then they were toast. They're right, by the way. So, on April the 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, stating, quote, the world must be made safe for democracy. America's participation helped bring about victory for the Allies, though they didn't play a major role on the battlefield. It was more the threat of American military capacity and industrial capacity. So on November the 11th, 1918, an armistice was signed by the Germans. Austria-Hungary had been knocked out of the war by this time. At the Paris Peace Conference, which opened in January 1919 and included the heads of the British, French, and Italian governments, Wilson, who traveled to Paris for the affair, helped negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is the official document that brings an end to World War I. According to many historians, it's also the document that sows the seeds for World War II. The reason being, the treaty went out of its way to punish Germany for the war, setting the stage for economic instability within Germany itself and the eventual rise of the Nazi Party. But the agreement included a charter for something brand new, a new idea. Wilson called this the League of Nations. It's basically the modern day UN. The League of Nations was an organization that intended to arbitrate and decide international disputes and explicitly to prevent future wars. Wilson had initially advanced the idea for a league in a speech in January 1918. This is also when he outlined his 14 points for a post-war peace settlement. I won't go through all the 14 points because it's not necessary for this. So let's just talk broadly. Wilson itemized 14 strategies, and their goal was as follows: ensure national security and world peace. Several points address specific territorial issues in Europe. But the most significant section set a tone for post-war American diplomacy. For a long time, America had been inching towards intervention in foreign affairs. That is compared to isolationism, staying by ourselves. In one of the 14 points, Wilson proposed that the backbone of U.S. foreign policy should become intervention that supported American interests, especially American business interests across the globe. Wilson could foresee that international relations would only become more important to American security and global commerce. So he advocated equal trade conditions, arms reductions, and national sovereignty for former colonies of Europe's weakening empires. One of Wilson's purposes in delivering the 14-point speech was to present a practical alternative to the traditional notion of international balance of power, the viability of this, which had been shattered by World War I. It was also the hope of trying to stay out of a growing conflict in Russia as a result of internal conflict in the Bolshevik Revolution. And the United States doesn't really become militarily involved in Russia as a result. Wilson hoped to keep, in fact, a conflict-riddled Russia on the Allied side in the war. That's not going to work. The Bolsheviks are going to cut and run and make their own peace treaty with the Central Powers. And this is, by the way, going to cause tons of problems in Central Europe, because then it's going to be superseded by the Treaty of Versailles. So everything that Russia and Germany and other countries agree to is going to get stripped off the board, and we're going to have to redo everything. But that's all European history, so we won't go into it. Still, it is crucial to note that Wilson's 14 points did contribute to the Central Powers' willingness to end the war. The only problem with all this was when Wilson got home from Europe in the summer of 1919, he encountered vicious opposition to the Treaty of Versailles that he had just negotiated. Don't forget, Congress under the Constitution has to ratify treaties. Wilson might have negotiated this, but he can't get the American people to agree to it without Congress's approval. Isolationists and Republicans feared that the League could limit America's autonomy and draw America into another war. In order to try to sell his treaty, that September, Wilson embarked on a cross-country speaking tour to promote his ideas for the League directly to the American people. This tour, however, was exhausting. On the night of September 25th, on a train bound for Wichita, Kansas, President Woodrow Wilson collapsed from mental and physical stress and canceled the rest of his tour. On October 2nd, he suffered a stroke that kept him partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. Wilson's condition, though, was largely kept hidden from the public, and his wife worked behind the scenes to fulfill a number of his administrative duties. The Senate voted on the Treaty of Versailles first in November 1919, and then again in March 1920. Both times it failed to gain the two-thirds vote required for ratification. The treaty's defeat was partly blamed on Wilson's refusal to compromise with the Republicans. The League of Nations held its first meeting in January 1920, but the United States would never join the organization, as indicated by the political cartoon that you can see on the screen right there. By the way, the Getty Museum has tons of these. If you're ever interested in checking them out, they're fantastic. However, in December 1920, Wilson actually received the 1919 Nobel Peace Prize. for his efforts to include the Covenant of the League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles. So I guess for him it wasn't all bad. Let's talk a little bit about his second term domestic agenda, because even though World War I was going on, a couple of significant things did happen. There were two significant constitutional amendments that were made during Wilson's second term, part of which, again, he was incapacitated for, but he was still president. The era of prohibition, which means alcohol is now illegal, began on January the 17th, 1920, when the 18th Amendment banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol went into effect following its ratification 1 year earlier. Wilson did not support this. In 1919, Wilson vetoed the National Prohibition Act, or as it's normally called, the Volstead Act, designed to enforce the 18th Amendment, but his veto was overridden by Congress. Prohibition is going to last until 1933, when it gets repealed by the 21st Amendment. Also in 1920, American women finally got the right to vote when the 19th Amendment became law. And Wilson, in this case, had actually pushed Congress to pass the amendment. However, Wilson's continued support for racist ideologies such as the film The Birth of a Nation continued to dog at his efforts at equality. After leaving office in March 1921, Wilson resided in Washington, D.C., working briefly as a lawyer. He died at his home on February the 3rd, 1924, at the age of 67. He was buried in the Washington National Cathedral. You can go see his tomb today, and he actually remains the only American president to be interred within the nation's capital.